Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Advanced Trick Theory. Today we're going to be talking about something that seems simple but actually has a lot of nuance to it, and that is hitting gaps. And hitting gaps is just a fancy way of saying flying through a small opening. So without further ado, let's get into the instruction. Alright, so to hit a gap, it's really all about the setup and lining up for the gap, because once you're close enough to the gap, it really doesn't matter what you do. And obviously, after you're through the gap, it doesn't really matter what you do. So there's really three main things that matter to get through a gap. The first of those is good throttle management. And this is actually the topic of the first episode of Advanced Trick Theory, so I recommend you watch that. But the main takeaway is you don't want to be flying around like this, on and off the throttle all the time, because when you're flying through a gap, you're going to have a hard time maintaining your altitude if you have a tendency to make rather large throttle changes to maintain altitude. So instead, you want to think of it as staying with a relatively constant throttle and making micro adjustments up and down with the throttle to stay level. And a good way to practice this is just fly really close to the ground, just cruising around. And that'll train you to have really smooth and precise throttle control, which you want for getting through a small gap. Now the next thing is roll, and that's kind of the way you line up side to side for a gap. So it's kind of the same deal. You don't want to be making big changes to your yaw when you're trying to fly through something. You don't want to be doing this. Obviously I'm exaggerating, but really the way you want to think about it is, instead of making a large adjustment right over a short period of time, so a lot of stick for a little amount of time, which could work to get through the gap if you need to adjust, it's better to make a small adjustment over a longer period of time. That's going to give you more control over where you are side to side. So yes, both will technically work for lining yourself up side to side, but if you're making that small adjustment, to line up like this, it's a lot easier than if you're trying to line up like all this, and so you have to bail because I can't make it like that. Alright, so the last thing is speed, and that's pretty much determined by your pitch. So obviously you don't want to be flying too fast through the gap, because then you're not going to have enough time to line yourself up. But you actually can fly too slow through a gap, and if you're flying too slow, it actually means you're taking a longer time to get through the gap, so you have to be even more precise with your flying, and it's easier to be less precise. So if you're flying, this slow through a gap, you're gonna crash. So in general, yes, slower is better because you have more time to react. But if you're going too slow, close to a standstill, then it's actually harder because you have to fly through the gap longer. So those are basically the three main things to get through a gap. A lot of it just comes down to smoothness and of course practice, but it's really easy, especially if you're more of a beginner, to panic and start making big adjustments because you don't think you're going to make it. It's really better to just try to hold your line, and your damage to your quad will be less even if you don't make the gap, if you just try to hold your line instead of making big adjustments. So part of that can be a mental block, just getting over that, training yourself not to panic and not to make too big of an adjustment last minute. Another thing that can help, I found this help for me when I was learning, is actually to take the gap at a bit of a turn. So just like a big sweeping turn. It depends on how you fly, but this might be easier for you, especially because one of the first things you learn is how to turn. So if you're taking the gap while you're turning, it might actually be a little easier for you. And that also, I think, makes it so you can make larger adjustments, especially with the roll, and not have such a big effect because you're already accelerating through the corner. Versus if you're flying dead on, the roll tends to feel a little more sensitive, and that makes it so you have to be a little more precise with how you're moving the sticks. All right, so that's how to get through the gap. Now, you can add a little bit of flair by doing tricks while you're going through the gap or right after you go through the gap, which is fun. So, you know, there's a certain point at which, you've lined up so well that, you know, you can basically do whatever and your quad's still gonna make it through the gap. So there's a certain distance before you hit the gap where you can basically do whatever you want if you've lined yourself up correctly. And that's the point at which you can throw in a flip or a roll or anything you really want. And that makes it look a lot cooler, but honestly it doesn't require much extra pilot skill because it's all about the setup. And once you have the setup down, doing a trick through the gap is really straightforward because you don't even have to think about it if your lineup is good. So that's pretty much it. All right, so that's it for this episode of Advanced Trick Theory. I hope you guys learned something, and let me know down in the comments what you guys want to see in future episodes of Advanced Trick Theory. And I know a lot of you guys watching this aren't subscribed, so if you enjoy this content, please get subscribed, give it a like, and thanks for watching.